Is the framework that is used to justify all of this logic against India and its civilization. And who are these people that are going around spreading it? Who trained them? Who funded them? What's behind all this? So that is three parts. What is the poison, which is ideology? Who are the snakes that are going around doing all this? And they tend to be large in the regions, but they're largely being trained outside India. And then where is the nest of snakes? And we've discovered that the central think tank is Harvard, which is such a huge discovery because Harvard is considered like, this is like God. They're like the Devta. We call them Vishwa Guru. We've accepted them as Vishwa Guru, but they are the Vishwa Guru of poisonous ideology as far as India is concerned. Now they have many good things also. Harvard is good for science, engineering, technology, those kind of disciplines, but I'm talking about your field of social sciences and social sciences, humanities, that kind of a thing. So the first three part is the poison, who spreads it, and where are these people being produced on an industrial scale. Then the fourth part is how do they arrive in India? How does this poison and how do these snakes carrying the poison arrive in India? And we are finding there's a huge network. There's Kriya University, there's Godrej Culture Labs, there's TIS, in Bombay, there's Ashoka University, there is Azim Premji stuff, there is a lot of these things. Not only these universities, but there's also some of the places, people like Niti Aayog have taken some of these Harvard guys who are doing all this work and brought them in as advisors. And then you find a lot of industrialists funding all this. So this is it's a huge discovery, a huge issue. It's not going to be easy to digest this in India. We think some people are going to attack us and accuse us and blame us. As long as it's in a civilized way, as long as it's courteous and mutual respect, we would welcome any criticism, any opportunities to debate. We are not hitting anyone below the belt. In fact, we are very respectful when we say that the billionaires are investing in Harvard's snake factory or this poison factory. We're saying that they're probably doing it out of ignorance, they are not informed, we don't know why they're doing it, we're giving them the benefit of doubt. We're not saying that they're bad people. Sometimes a good person is writing a check and not knowing that it's being misused. So maybe we should be welcomed by them as people who are giving them this advice, then they can take it accordingly. So that's what this whole book is about. This whole idea of snakes and is sort of a metaphor for that.
You have to train an entire class of people. Your first book, you talked about the church intervention in India. Now this place is talking about academics primarily, as I understood it. Teaching that is being generated, what is the understanding of the theories being generated outside that are going to harm India? In what way are they poisonous?
Surprises as far as the theoretical part is concerned. I've called it the Americanization of Marxism. Now you expect that Americans are against Marxism, they are. But they don't realize that Marxism has entered the United States. In fact, the US is Marxism has been kind of reinvented and repackaged in another way. It's called critical race theory and wokeism. So most Americans are very shocked when you tell them that this is Marxism, they don't want to believe it. In fact, those who are propagating wokeism, I had a huge debate about that. He's saying, no, this is not Marxism, so I had to convince him and then he accepted it. So Marxism is about oppressor-oppressed. Oppressor-oppressed. People are categorized in these two ways. And the idea is that the oppressor controls the discourse, is the hegemonic discourse, and you have to build an antithesis, a counter discourse between the thesis and the antithesis. So it's like a revolution, you have to have violent revolution to destroy, and then out of this destruction a new thing will emerge. The problem is that they've never succeeded in producing any new thing. They have no experience in constructing anything new. They have a lot of experience in destruction. So it's a destructive, in practice, since Marx started, there is not one instance where after destroying they've been able to construct something new, which is what the theory calls for. So this destructiveness has arrived in the United States and it's affecting America. Just yesterday I did an interview with an American professor. He's written one of the forewords to this book, and I have this term, breaking America. So I'm telling the Americans that this is breaking America like breaking India. So we are going to come up with jointly something called Breaking America and Breaking India, because it's the same thing, breaking both. Now, this Americanization of Marxism has entered the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter movement was an old movement, but it suddenly became important after George Floyd. And they were looking for a theoretical basis because originally it was okay, so racism, white supremacists, and blacks as slaves, and now they're emancipated and they're still persecuted, and all that gets sympathy. And I also funded Black Lives Matter and helped them and joined their organization. But then soon it was appropriated by these critical race theory Marxist people. So they turned it into oppressor, oppress, the same logic. Once it becomes turned into Marxism, then certain things happen. One of them is that there are people called protected classes, which means that you cannot criticize certain people. And you cannot criticize them because then you're considered racist. Then there's something called cancel culture, which means that if you are tagged, if you are branded as the oppressor class, you have no right to speak. And in fact, if you speak, we're going to cancel you, censor you very officially because you are the oppressor. You shouldn't speak. So this actually ends free speech and good discourse, and you cannot really solve problems in this kind of an atmosphere. So now the question is, who gets to be the oppressed? So who gets to decide it? Well, certain people have designated themselves as people who are going to decide. So besides blacks, Muslims were included, that okay, there are Muslims also oppressed. Okay, so then LGBTQ are included. And that's when the Dalits arrived and said, we too are oppressed, and we are the blacks of India. And the oppressors are the whites of India, and they're all the non-Dalits are the oppressors. So this was a very good, big coalition. So these critical race theory people said, this is excellent, we now got a big support. So a lot of people arrived in places like Harvard to say that there is this thing called Afro-Dalit. So the Africans and Dalits have unified into this Afro-Dalit identity. And these people are based at Harvard. There's a lot of bye-bye between them, brotherhood. So the Americans don't know too much about Jati, Varna, caste. They don't know the history and all that. They don't know the history of Islamic rule in India. They don't know that. So when this mapping is done, they have assumed that the Hindus are like the whites and the Muslims are like the blacks. The upper castes are like the whites and the Dalits are like the blacks. The straight people are like the white suppressors, and the LGBT people are like the blacks. So the oppressed has been mapped onto the Indian society in a very weird way without debate. So if you go stand up and debate, then you'll be considered you are the oppressor, you are a slave or slave owner, whatnot. Caste theory is not logical. But that has been done, it has not been questioned, and therefore it's got a life of its own. As this was happening over the years, I tried getting Indian thinkers involved. The Culture Ministry wanted nothing to do with it. Indian Council of Cultural Relations didn't have any time for any of this. People in India didn't have time for this. Academic scholars didn't have, I could go on naming a lot of, but nobody wanted to deal with it because it's unpopular, they don't understand it, they thought, chalta hai, everything will be fine. But things have picked up and become worse. So we thought we should have this book in order to alert people that this is going to get even worse. So that's the poison, that's the intellectual poison that is now flooding India. And as you said, the last few generations of Indian scholars in English honors, in social studies, in liberal arts, have been trained in the United States, from post-colonial studies to subaltern studies to postmodernism to now critical race theory. It's become the fashion. And so to be considered erudite and scholarly, you got to be able to quote all these things, and you got to be able to show that you are a person who is championing the liberation of these people who are considered oppressed. And to wash off your own guilt, you have to be real tough on your own culture.
Sure.
You have to stand up and say, I am part of this abusive culture, and then they'll clap, they'll send you a first-class ticket to Harvard, and they'll give you a slot to give a big speech and promote you. So a lot of Indians are for sale. A lot of Indians are into this. And if you look at the departments and the centers which are producing this, and we've covered each one in a separate chapter, you will find that in the last 5-8 years, a few thousand people have gone through this training. If you look at all the people who've been brought into conferences and seminars and given grants and all that,
Scholarships, fellowships.
so scholarships, fellowships, it's a very large army of sepoys that they've created, and these people are now in different Indian universities and Indian government. This is strange, Indian government, HR departments in corporate, and they're bringing in something called ESG, and diversity, equity and inclusion, which is basically corporatizing, bringing into the business world all these things. So the matter is very serious, and it's surprising me that nobody in India has bothered to take this matter seriously.
And I also remember that they did this dismantling global Hindutva conference.
Yes.
And the critical caste theory was used as a very good tool
Yes.
to dismantle all that, because they could attack Brahmins
Right.
and through them the patriarchy, and then
Right.
they could smash Brahminical patriarchy.
Right.
Through that.
And it's very, the amount of evidence here is huge. By the way, I want to say one thing to people about the book, because the size of the book scares a lot of people. But don't be scared, because you need to read 100 pages. Each chapter has a 1-page overview, maybe 1.5 pages. So the overview is basically telling you what's the message, what are the highlights, what are the points in that chapter. So if you read the introduction and the 22 overviews and the conclusion, in about 100 pages, you'll know a lot about the book, and that's what you can do that in 2-3 hours. Then you can dive into whichever chapter in more detail. You don't have to read them in sequence. So for instance, if you want to know why the IITs are being attacked, how they're being attacked as a patriarchy and Brahmin thing and anti-Dalit, there's a certain chapter 4, and you don't have to read anything else, and our response to that. If you want to see this whole take on why China has taken over Harvard, how have they done differently than our billionaires, and how that's bad for India, there's a chapter of that. If you want to see what is Anand Mahindra's Humanities Center, it's called the Mahindra Humanities Center, what is it up to, what is wrong with it, what is from our point of view an issue, there's one chapter on that, one chapter on Lakshmi Mittal's South Asia studies. So like that, each of the main points that you will find that we're making has been treated in detail in a particular chapter, separate chapters. So that you don't need to read the whole thing, you just read the overview level, and then you dive deep as you need to.
Enough it has come to,
And
it's
12 years ago,
right
people
into
could have taken
stage.
it seriously.
Yes.
People could have engaged the African community and said, don't fall for this. And because, they could have brought in Martin Luther King was very much pro-India and considered Gandhi to be his mentor. But what has happened is this critical race theory does not even go along the lines of Martin Luther King or Gandhi, because they were not into dismantling structures. They were not into dismantling nation state, dismantling family, they were not into all this patriarchy business. They felt that within the existing structures, blacks ought to be given equal rights. So the thing would be that within the existing structures of constitution, existing structure of social society in India, Dalits should be given equal status. So, but this is of advice and warning from us to take this matter seriously. But there's no leadership, no strategic thinking. So we are sort of reacting to when a fire comes up, we go running around trying to put it out.
But are we really reacting, Rajiv? Have you seen any efforts from India into really understanding, analyzing, and then creating counter arguments to this Afro-Dalit movement?
No, I mean, we don't see that. I mean, I see a lot of, the first book created over 100 activists, starting these YouTube channels and starting Manthan, and some gentleman here was telling me they're starting a group tomorrow on Indic dialogue, Indic civilization, Indic studies around the world. I said there's 100 such initiatives people have started. But they're all at a very superficial level. They're all at what I call Breaking India 1.0, which is a 12-year-old thesis we have. This is Breaking India 2.0, because things have moved in a whole different direction. So it's not enough to criticize George Soros and the church and these kind of things, because that's of course true, but the threats that we now have are of an entirely different level and far more intense.
Vijaya, I would like to ask you about your own field, since your expertise lies in curricula and pedagogy. What is your view on the inclusion of liberal arts and liberal studies in the national education policy? And is liberal arts truly liberating, as we spontaneously use these two together? as if they need each other.
So in the US also, many intellectuals feel within liberal arts, of course, you have the sciences, but if you take all the departments that end in the word studies, they are all about grievance. So grievance studies is the overarching umbrella, and so you have grievance studies, fat studies. Fat studies is not about getting people healthy, but it's about body, not avoiding body shaming and things like that. So and that's why you see models these days that are morbidly obese. So that that's sort of the product of so it comes to the popular culture. So so you have so gender studies, sexuality studies, queer studies, so all grievance studies. So the one of the I forget who it was, a professor in America who was sort of against all of this, talked about the idea of idea laundering. So a bunch of people get together and say, okay, this is something that we feel that we should start studies on, and basically an idea gets laundered into scholarship. A bunch of them get together, they peer review, they form a journal, they reference each other, and then they don't let anybody else in, and they form this little cabal of whatever they're studying. So even in the US, you have people who don't recognize these things as studies, as proper sciences or proper fields of knowledge, if you will, because they're based on lived experience, not rationality, things like that. So with the NEP opening up the floodgates to foreign universities, there are lots of problems because they might have thought that we would avoid people sending their kids overseas, and we can instead have these, which was a noble sort of idea. But what happens is you have a lot of money. So for example, Ashoka University, you spend 10 lakhs a year, over 10 lakhs a year, for 4 years to get a bachelor's degree in gender studies. And
another university I know charges 45 lakhs for a 4-year program in liberal studies.
Right. Yeah. So it's expensive. So then you have so basically what are they giving? So when we have MIT having a venture with Kriya University. Now when you hear the word, the name MIT, you would think science, technology, space programs, but MIT is not coming for that. MIT is sort of selling you economics through this social justice lens. So there's critical consciousness, as they call it, and critical consciousness you think is like critical reasoning, and it has nothing to do with that. It's basically critical consciousness is the CRT lens of oppressor oppressed in anything you see in life. So and in this particular case, MIT has so the Saudis fund MIT. They have a poverty action lab. It's called Jameel something Poverty Action Lab, JPAL it's called, and JPAL has a partnership with Kriya University to study poverty. Now, not many people know that Saudi Arabia itself has there's 25% poverty, in Saudi Arabia. So they're not solving their problems at home. Saudi Arabia has 7 million people that don't have bank accounts, out of which 65% are women. Saudi Arabia has very classes. There are the super rich, then the sort of middle class, and the rest of the people are poor. Saudi Arabia is the #1 ranking country that wastes the most amount of food in the world. So that's a problem when there's so much poverty and they are actually wasting food. So we can go on. But then Saudi Arabia gives money to MIT and for JPAL, and JPAL is having, so that's the liberal arts that we get. We're stupid if we think we're getting science, technology, things like that. So this is MIT that's doing this. So in our book, we show all the different relationships of what is the liberal arts. So what's the bang for the buck? So now Harvard has come to India. They've opened an office in Delhi. And it's an ATG. It's for donations. So not only we had billionaires give money there, now they want the army to give you 100 rupees, and and it's a donation, so they get a tax break. And so essentially we're losing revenue, we're losing income tax, which is your tax money, which is going towards giving Harvard a break. to spread this poison further.
Also, didn't we give a huge grant of about 4.1 million or something to award prize money to Amartya Sen? To Harvard.
That was in 2012. So there was Ronan Sen, who was the Indian ambassador to the US. And Ronan Sen, when Amartya Sen got his Nobel Prize in 2012, and he gave $5 million, and he was begging Harvard, would you please take this, because we're so thrilled that Amartya Sen got the Nobel Prize. And many thinkers and journalists in the US said that Harvard should not take it because this is a third world country and $5 million is a lot of money. 2012, $5 million, And then Ronan was like excited because finally Harvard said yes and took the money, right? Now, Ronan also, incidentally, there is a group of Mormon church, and there are lots of it's sort of a cultish kind of church, and there are many people who leave the church, and there are Mormon files that get leaked, and so in the Mormon files is embedded a video where a senator from Utah, where the Mormons are predominantly present, says that we want missionary visas. We're not able to get it through the front door, but we've been told by the Indian diplomat Ronan Sen that he will arrange it for us through the back door. So Ronan Sen gives $5 million, arranges visas for over 100 missionaries to come into India, and then he of course retires, and right before he retires or right after that he gets the Padma Bhushan or something. So this is sort of the state of affairs of Ronan Sen. But what we can take about liberal arts, so I can understand that the government doesn't know all these things, fair enough, and you think liberal arts everybody wants, there's a thirst, so let's open it up, fine. But I think the government can look at the case of Singapore. So Yale University had this partnership with NUS in Singapore, and they started the Yale-NUS deal partnership. Now, in the MOU, the Singaporeans are very smart. They just had a 10-year agreement, which could be renewed in 2024. And this whole thing did not go too well. They had a class called a course titled, I think, Modes of Dissent and Resistance in Singapore. And this the Singaporean government just flipped. They said, what is this? We don't have, why should you teach this? Just because you have the academic freedom, it should be used wisely, and it doesn't fit the ethos of Singapore. So the education minister went to the parliament and said, this just doesn't work for us. They produced another paper from the Lee Kuan Yew public policy think tank, saying that over 90% of Singaporeans think they respect each other, they respect all races, they love brotherhood, and therefore we have our own think tank that's saying this. So they rejected the Yale and US partnership, and they have not renewed it. So they've kicked out Yale. So at a time when other countries, and Singapore also has a diversity. It has Malays, it has Indians, it has the ethnic Chinese, and the ethnic Chinese were called Chinese patriarchy, and so they were trying to do the same thing. And they said, we don't want this because Singapore, if you damage Singapore's reputation as a country that has these kinds of divisive population, then all our businesses will go, and we cannot afford that because Singapore is very, very dependent on being a stable government, and it's very important for our business. So they just chucked Yale University out of Singapore and said, no more of this. So we can learn, it's like all of us, right? If we want to make a decision, we look at our friend circle and find somebody who's smart, who makes good decisions, and say, hey, so what did you do about that? So I think even Indian government can learn, right, from Singapore.
But do we have the will to do it? Because as you've discussed in the book, Rajivji, China has a very good stronghold over Harvard. And in fact, I was checking, after reading this book, I was checking the Anand Mahindra Humanities Center, and they have a Chinese humanities department within the humanities department. So is China also not vulnerable to all of this? Is China also not facing all this, kind of attack from Harvard? Or are they in a position of power and they're repulsing all of these, or stopping all of these, or they're in control of all these attacks?
So actually China's situation in Harvard is quite the opposite of India. China's billionaires have been very patriotic. India's billionaires are more self-serving. There's no strategy putting all of them in a nationalistic way to approach. So a good example is T.A. Chan School of Public Health is based on, it's named after Chinese, and the two sons of this Mr. Chan, they're named after their father. They're associated with the Communist Party of China, which we've shown. They brought in $350 billion and they gave it to Harvard to change the Harvard public school into the Chan. And so that is basically aligned with Chinese policy. They have never criticized China's role in the COVID. They have basically, they're silent on the problems in China. But Piramal has started the Piramal Public Health at Harvard as a subsidiary under the Chan school. So Chan is the umbrella, public health. Underneath that is the Piramal. And in the Piramal, they're doing all kinds of projects and funding and this and that. Fine, it's their right, it's their money, they can do what they want with it. But we pointed out where some of the reports are things like, during COVID, maybe minorities were not given proper treatment, Dalits, Muslims, they were not given proper treatment by the Indian government. So even a field like public health is being used to kind of talk about the divisiveness of society rather than talking about public health. And you would think that a patriotic people like Piramal, and I consider them good people, certainly, you would think that they would have championed Ayurveda. They haven't. You would think that they would champion that India has done a remarkable job in the vaccination of any country in the world. I don't see that as a topic. You would think that WHO, which didn't didn't certify and didn't acknowledge the Indian vaccine, they should have put pressure on them. They invited the head of the WHO for the convocation, and he's a VIP and he comes to Harvard and he's celebrated, but they are not lobbying the Indian point of view, they're lobbying the Chinese point of view. So if you take public health at Harvard as an example, and the same is true in many departments, what has happened is the Chinese giving is a very strategic giving. They are very aligned with the billionaires are aligned with the government, they come together. The other thing is, on the Indian side, the billionaire comes and he gets his kids in college, in Harvard, or he gets to sit on a board or gets in a prestigious committee, or he just feels like I'm a billionaire and I'm now world elite now. Rather than just being an elite in India, I go with somebody on their private jet to some island somewhere. I go on the yacht with this famous guy. I hobnob with Bill Gates and with Warren Buffett and all these famous people. So the Indians are more into their personal, lifestyle and feeling glorified and all that on a world stage. It's not necessarily that they're doing this out of nationalism. They're not doing it patriotically. So you will find that Chinese engagement in the United States is mainly bringing tech people to bring technology back, including stealing some technology. So they are into STEM, they are not into humanities, they are not sending their students to learn human rights, social justice, gender justice, grievance justice, LGBTQ justice, women's studies, feminist studies. They are not sending Chinese for that. They are sending the Chinese students in an orchestrated way, in a strategic way, to study the technologies and sciences and medicine and all these kind of things which are useful for China, to bring back this knowledge. They were doing it for a long time, which is why they have advanced so much in those fields. And Indians, on the other hand, have no strategy. So you can go for STEM education, or you can go and study some human rights and become an activist and somebody who's divisive and all that. Nobody in India has got a policy on that. I don't think the HRD ministry has a policy. I don't think the External Affairs ministry has a policy. I don't think the national security people have a policy. I don't even think they're studying the problem and taking it seriously.
Umbrella affecting our families. How is it targeting the family structure? How is it targeting children? How is it targeting the entire structure of Hinduism?
So, it's very interesting. You would think that, okay, if you want justice for a race or justice for a certain caste, that's fine, but what does it have to do with family life? What family life? So now what they have come up with as part of critical race theory is that you must dismantle family structures, because family reproduces the bias into the next generation. So the theory is that child is born And because the parents are biased and the parents are oppressors, the child will also grow to be an oppressor. The parents are patriarchal, the parents are supremacist, Hindu supremacist or white supremacist in the case of America. So therefore, unless the family is dismantled, the family is going to perpetuate this. So these people who are to the Afro-Dalit, they're going around telling Indian students that you should revolt against your parents. And so parents are spending all this money to send their kids, and parents don't know that this kid is going to come back and actually is not even interested in the parental heritage. So this is why you will find that a lot of these billionaires, the senior generation, were very patriotic and very loyal to our culture. Next generation they go and those kids are not interested in these things, and they've come back cynical and antagonistic, and and the parents are shocked. They don't know what happened, but those 4 years in that university have switched them around. So this is a very these are things that ought to be brought to the surface. People should we all we are saying is we want to be able to discuss these, but we're not allowed to because there's cancel culture. I've experienced cancel culture for 30 years now. And I'm one of the earliest victims, long-term victims. Before the term cancel culture was around in a popular way, I was experiencing cancel culture because I refused to toe the line. I am not a dogmatic person saying I'm right and you are wrong. I'm saying I may be wrong and I'll change my mind. But let's talk, let's discuss. I have a right to speak. And you have a right to speak too. You have a right to disagree with me and criticize me, but I have a right to that too. So I'm totally for open discussion and
must
debate.
engage.
It must engage. And this is not allowed in places which are claiming to be the centers of freedom and intellectual life and whatnot, and the word liberal and all that, actually are basically propaganda. That's what is perpetrated. If you follow the line, you will be doing very well in your career. They'll give you all kind of benefits. You don't follow the line, then you'll be cancelled, you'll be put aside, you'll be attacked, all of that.
So is it Harvard South Asian Studies?
That role for the East India Company. They were the center of Indology, studying India in all kind of ways, and that's where the East India Company officers were trained. And then based on the thinking of Oxford, the scholarship of Oxford, they set up 20 different colleges in England where they would have a huge scale operation to train people. And then they would set up mirror images in India to do the same. So now Harvard is playing that kind of a role. It's got so much prestige, it's got so much money, it's got so much clout, nobody can bother to stand up. It's very interesting. There is no other book which challenges Harvard. This is the first book that actually takes on Harvard. Because you would think that big players always get some resistance. There are books on criticizing Bill Gates, there are books criticizing all kinds of big shots, big institutions. Books in America criticizing the church, books criticizing any president. But Harvard has somehow managed to be such that there aren't people who are standing up and doing a systematic study and saying Harvard is the snake nest. And so we are sticking our necks out and we're out there putting ourselves at risk, but that's what we have to do.
As databases for themselves and also to keep an account of their assets. So these maps are all still being reproduced in the form of data, in the form of presentations that we see in various seminars and various think tanks, which present data to you, very selective data, which convinces you that these are the people who have brought the truth to you, and you were living in living in a haze till now. So what is Harvard contributing? What kind of think tanks is Harvard also nurturing under its umbrella?
This is a very huge topic that you've raised. So there's a famous book called Imagined Communities, which is taught all over the world in the post-colonial studies, American professor wrote, in which he did a brilliant job. He says that the way the British captured and controlled the colony is through the census, the map, and the museum. Because these are ways you can sort of represent people in your own framework, and then that's who you become. You are being mapped and catalogued and classified, and your identity is in terms that the colonizer has decided. So this is the naksha, this is the map, and you belong in that. And so they did it through these mechanisms very systematically, and this is the way you assert power over these people in a very sort of intellectual way and emotional way. So they're dislocated and disconnected from their own sense of who they are, because their sense is based on, they belong to this jati, they belong to this gotra, they have this kul devta, they have this linguistic thing, and they belong to this gharana of music. I mean, their sense of who they are is very differently done. So you've disconnected them from all the traditional ways of self-representation and turned it into the colonizer's representation. It's a representation system that you've completely re-engineered. So now, this is also happening in modern times with artificial intelligence and databases, where the representation of a community is being done by these machine learning things, and the people who control this are profiling and deciding where you belong, what kind of thing you respond to, what kind of thing you respond against, what kind of ad we should put there because you are more likely to click, how to arouse anger in you, which group you belong and whom are you likely to hate, how to make you hate, how we can make you fight. So that's how the British used to do. Without this technology, using those tools, they could do divide and rule, because they understood that we do this thing and we can incite them to fight against those guys, and we do this thing, we make him happy, and we do this other thing, we make them angry. So they knew how to control people. So the new mapping India at Harvard is so sophisticated. They have a project called Mapping the Kumbh Mela. They did that project, and I produced a report 10 years ago or something, and we gave a few lakh copies of English and Hindi. So much excitement, and people were very angry and upset that this Harvard group is called Mapping the Kumbh Mela, and they're looking at the caste structure, the gender structure, are Muslims being given equal rights, and can they do their namaz over there in the Ganga, all this kind of stuff they were doing to create trouble, so that people could come in and do all that. And we raised this awareness, but at the same time we were disappointed at the lack of action on the part of the Indian government. And in fact, the Indian government invited places like Harvard to come and study even more. So then there is mapping the partition. All in the next few years, all databases, all archives, notes, articles, videos, whatever exists, oral testimony about the partition will belong in Harvard, because they are buying it. If you have a family history and you want to present it, they'll fly you there, give you the money, and you turn over this material, and it belongs to them. It belongs to their archive. Harvard, you have to go there, and under their terms, giving you permission or not giving you permission, how much permission, they'll decide. You'll have access to the database with which the information, the written material, the Biblia, all of that to do your work. Like right now, if you want to study the British Empire, you have to go to England. There are so many libraries there where they control all this stuff. So even when they digitize, we feel very proud they're digitizing, but they control the rights to it, and they can turn it off, turn it on whenever they want. So we, with this book, mentioned about a dozen different database projects in Harvard. They're doing DNA gathering of Indians, DNA gathering of Indians on a large scale. Americans and Chinese are gathering the databases of DNAs of people around the world, especially India, more so than the Indian government has. Then there is archive on tribal languages, tribal issues. Then there is another billionaire, a younger version of George Soros, who's creating databases on legal issues, legal fights that people are having, database on who's suing whom, what kind of legal things happen. And so if they want to quickly do a search on who are the Indians in this region, in this particular area, who are financially in trouble and have legal fights with each other, and the fight tends to be an inter-ethnic or inter-religious, quickly it will pop out, these are the targets. So those are the people for sale, maybe. Those are the people you can buy and influence them. And how to influence them. So the database is immense amount of power, especially with this new computing stuff that's coming out, the AI kind of stuff. And these databases are owned by Harvard. So public health databases, databases on seeds, agriculture, seeds databases. So, all of this is being presented as separate. So the partition project is separate. The Kumbh Mela project is separate. In Harvard, it's all together. But in India, it comes as separate. So it comes as, okay, now there is this seeds database. They're going to tell us about varieties of seeds and how to make them better. there's another project that they're going to help poor people in the villages in India about some kind of their caste structure database and their languages and whatnot. So, but we are so naive. Nobody in India is putting it all together. Harvard is putting it together. So this new mapping of India, like the old mapping was census, the census and the map and the museum. The new mapping is all of these kind of things. Harvard is far more powerful than Oxford ever was. And we don't even have anybody interested in any of our departments who could even give us time of day to bother reading this stuff. And we've been doing this research for a long time and until COVID, I used to come here 4 times a year and looking for all kind of audiences, ministries, whoever will listen, but people will listen to you, they'll give you a nice meal, they'll give you some chai and samosas and talk to you, give you a selfie and send you off. But they really don't care. I'm surprised at the lack of intellectual depth in India, even to study threats that face us.
I also read about this organization called PERI, which is asking people to upload their photographs, videos and documentaries of their experiences, which they are collecting in their database. And also they're running a teachers training program that you've mentioned in your book.
Yes.
So the teachers as well as the students are free to write their own histories.
Right.
That's a big.
Right.
So this is such a post-modernist thing that nothing is fixed. There is no theory that is fixed which you can learn from, and everything is experiential,
Right.
your own experience.
So so data is power, and data is now going to be in the hands of people outside. Between the Americans and the Chinese, I mean, the data mapping of India is so active, and we're up for sale.
Totally.
Basically, that's why India
On the data side, there's also Ashoka University's Trivedi Center, which collects data on every politician from the panchayat level up, their gender, their language, what their education level is, how much they've been earning, who are their friends, the entire thing. So can you imagine, and this is funded by the French Ministry, External Affairs Ministry, and American, University of California at Berkeley, and some other institutions. So and this is not a left or a right or a BJP or a Congress issue. It has just data on all the every election they stood, how many votes they got, how they lost.
A database on the entire Indian democratic, from independence till today, central level, state level, the history of panchayat level, the history of every single election, who won, the history of a candidate, the history of, so modeling the Indian democracy, building models, predictive models, and figuring out where to intervene and whom to influence, how to change. This is, when you have a database, then you know how to intervene. It's like your psychologist knows a profile of you. They've got a database of you in a psychological sense, and therefore they can manipulate you, they can help you, they can do whatever they want. It gives them power over you. So this is the ultimate of that kind, and that we have not even bothered to understand it. Our people don't even understand that what is going on and what is the significance of all this.
Why are we so blind to all these interventions in our own country, Rajivji? Is it that we don't understand, we do not connect the dots, or are we just unwilling to work hard enough to create an alternate narrative?
The thing is that I've been very disappointed in the sense that when I did my first Breaking India book, I thought that people will help me and we will do all these projects together. Instead, they copied the idea. They did the lazy thing of copy, plagiarize, and start their own movement and their own activism and their own channel here and there. So 100 copies of it happened, 100 copycat movements started, rather than taking it to the next level. Rather than helping and saying, okay, now you've taken it to level X, now let's take it to level Y together. Everybody copying the level X and making it their own. So that is very dissatisfying. You don't see traction in terms of helping move these kind of intellectual movements forward, neither from the government, not from the public, not from the academic world, not from the gurus. We tried all of those. So somehow people are just sort of very complacent, just going about life, and at the same time, people are, when you tell them about problems, they're very passionate, they're very emotional, but they're not doing anything about it.